All right, I'm going to go through this sheet real quick and give you some articles and short clips, I guess, of how to build more torque for your LS motor. There's tons of information and dyno pulls that show the peak horsepower numbers, but torque seems to get overlooked, and especially down low and part throttle. I'll go through the sheet quick, and then I'll show you some of the other stuff so helps you understand where everything's coming from. All right, primary benefits of torque are ET when you're racing, also street acceleration, especially part throttle, and pulling if you have a truck or you're pulling a heavy trailer or something, even with your car. Primarily, I'm talking about street use here. I mean, it can still perform at the track, but generally speaking, we're talking street use. The heads and exhaust and everything are very velocity biased, not volume. We're talking idle to 4,500 RPM for the most part as your maximum benefit. You want small valves and ports like the cathedral port heads, the 189s or the 2.0 intakes, not the larger ones. Shorter duration cam, not over 214. One heavily overlooked thing that none of the cam manufacturers are doing for off-the-shelf cams. The same intake and exhaust duration will have more torque than extra exhaust duration, and overlap should be kept down to 49 or less, preferably. Plus, it makes the idle easier to tune. Tighter LSA makes more torque, and advancing the cam generally makes more torque. Intake runners, you want long, narrow intake runners, and your exhaust manifolds are fine. And generally speaking, you do not need headers if you're not up to at least 400 horsepower. If you find some, 1 5/8 should be all you need to go. Otherwise, you're going to start losing low RPM torque, which all this together, if you build a high torque motor, it's going to has potential to increase your fuel economy. You can run a lower drive ratio, 342, and keep it a good highway RPM. You can run a lower stall speed converter, and you can increase your engine longevity because you can keep your RPMs down. One thing I don't have on here is maximizing your compression ratio, which you always want to do if you're doing your build. Try to run your compression ratio as high as you can, but if you run into spark knock, use AC 41-104 plugs, or a plug range colder than the 110s, and also 187 thermostat. I've got a few articles here from performance magazines and forums, and I'll try to read through these so it gives you a better understanding where everything's coming from. On this first one, it says, "Here I have often observed that the most experienced drivers are those who are most likely to run a single pattern camshaft, which is equal on intake and exhaust duration. Why? Because such cams always, I repeat, always make more torque." That's the first clip, just basically saying that a single pattern cam is what you want for the street if you're building torque and you're not going to spend your life racing at the track. All right, the second one is about LSA for torque. I built an engine for a 79 1-ton 454 with about 9-to-1 for towing, and ended up trying two cams similar to your scenario. The first cam was something like 260, 266 advertised on 112. The truck was down on torque while towing and would detonate unless burning premium. I tried a new cam 256 on 106 LSA, and it was like night and day. The truck picked up at least 50 foot-pounds, and pinging completely went away. You would think with this increased cylinder pressure from the tighter lobe separation would have made it worse. Maybe an EGR effect with slightly increased overlap. Also got 2 miles per gallon better towing with a lot less throttle for the same speed under load. And the response to this from Joe Sherman Racing: "I have seen the same thing several times myself," which means this is not uncommon when you tighten the LSA. And a couple of articles here, you can look these up yourself. I'll read a couple of quotes out of them, and it's basically the key points. In this one, it says, "A tighter LSA makes more low-end and peak torque at the expense of just a few top-end ponies. Tight LSA cams make excellent low-end torque and have a beautiful power curve. What is a good lobe separation angle? Some engine specialists refer to it as the 106 sound, the NASCAR and short track oval sound, where preferred lobe separation is usually defined between 104 and 106. The primary function of narrow lobe separation is to impel urgent acceleration off the turns when the throttle is opened, which is exactly what you're looking for coming off a stoplight. And that was from a different article that I can't seem to find anymore. Nonetheless, all right, here's another article, and the quote from there is, tighter LSA produces peak torque earlier, coming on quicker and stronger. And from another article, less duration fosters more low-end torque. Narrow lobe separation will foster good low RPM torque and good acceleration. This guy is an engineer, and he's built a lot of race-winning engines. He's done thousands of dyno tests, and he's come up with a really good formula on how to pick the LSA and duration and specs for your cam. And you'll notice by the title of the video, cam companies still have not got it right. I can assure you, when he's putting a motor together, he's not picking an off-the-shelf cam. This is the this is the formula he came up with for figuring out lobe separation angle. He likes to call it lobe centerline angle. Same thing, he just uses different terminology for some reason. Now, technically, this was used for a 10.5-to-1 small block Chevy, which also translates pretty well to an 8.5-to-1 LS motor with exhaust manifolds. The other video is here's another one. This shows how you should pick your overlap on your cam, where I was telling you that you should really limit it to 49 degrees maximum for a torque build. And you can see here, when they start at 50, you're starting to go up into the more horsepower range. Here's a few engine builds that he did. I'll let you take a look at this. The key thing you'll want to notice here on these builds, now these are traditional motors, so these are old school motors, but nonetheless, the physics are the same. If the LS motor is just a more efficient machine, that's all. Okay, now what's he using in his title here? 355 with huge torque, 383 with huge torque, and look at the numbers, 410 foot-pounds out of a 355 and 492 foot-pounds out of a 383. So we'll scroll down here more on the build. This is 9 to 1 and 9.5 to 1, so it's not like it's ridiculously out of range for pump gas. And if you scroll down to the cam specs here, what are they using? 107 LSA on one, 106 LSA on the other, right here. And both cams have the same intake and exhaust duration, here and here. So that's your primary thing for building torque on your motor. Those are very key components. I captured a screenshot of David Weiser's formula for figuring out the duration for your cam. And this, along with the LSAs, he come up with after thousands of dyno tests and his race-winning engines. I wanted to show you this video from Richard Holdner where he tested just the LSAs and try to point out a few things that maybe you didn't notice before. Typically, your wide LSA is going to win the horsepower race, and they'll come out ahead on top. In this case, the narrow LSA cam, which happens to be a 108 here, is almost perfect for this engine combination. And when you look at the numbers, the 108 wins in torque all the way across the curve, and it also wins in horsepower across the curve. So choosing the right LSA is a critical feature when you're putting your engine combination together. And here's another example I wanted to show you of port and valve sizes and the value of the smaller ones for more torque. The 317 and 823 heads are nearly identical combustion chambers, so then you don't get any difference in compression ratio. And that's the only thing they changed here was the heads. And you'll notice how the 317 heads hung with the 823s up till over 4100 RPM. And being as how this is a wide open throttle run, the 823s pulled away at that point. And this is also a over a 550 horsepower build on with the 823s. So if you're just running a rather modest street combination, this gap here in horsepower and torque is going to narrow up even more, where the 317 heads will be closer to equaling the 823s even up top. And the thing is here down low, what people probably aren't looking at is the 317s start to just barely start to pull ahead. And this is at wide open throttle. So that favors the 823s at wide open, and the 317s are actually starting to pull ahead in the low RPM. And if this was a part throttle, then the 317s would be even farther ahead. Plus, this doesn't even start until over 3,000 RPM. So standard street driving, where you're just steady state cruise at 1,500 to 2,000 or even 2,500, the 317s are going to provide you with more torque down low, which would be beneficial for fuel efficiency as long as you didn't get crazy with duration or overlap or something like that. All right, I put some information and numbers down on paper here to help bring all these formulas together, so it hopefully makes it a little easier to understand. This is all from David Vizard with his thousands of dyno tests, and the 10.5 to 1 small block Chevy was his most common run, so that's where he was giving out that formula. But it does translate well to the LS motor with exhaust manifolds on 8.5 to 1 dynamic compression. So the formula would be that your LSA should be 128 minus cubic inches of displacement divided by 8 divided by intake valve diameter times 0.91. And when you look at it, all the numbers here, this is for your 862, 706 heads. Here's your 243, 799s, and this is your 823, 821s, and your 4853, 6062, and then your LSA is figured out after that. Now, if you have to deviate from the formula, the 128 formula, and change the LSA, a wider LSA will lose more power faster than a tighter one. And that was somewhat noticeable in Richard Holdner's test, where the 108 LSA basically cleaned house over those wide LSAs. So if you have to deviate, it'll be beneficial for you to go with a tighter LSA than a narrower one, or a wider one, excuse me. In one of his videos, you'll find out that he says for every point of compression ratio drop, you subtract 0.6 from the LSA, so you make it tighter. So that's a big thing for going from 10.5 to 8.5 to 1, because that's 2 points in the compression, which is 1.2 in LSA. Now, also, if you have a restrictive exhaust, you tighten up your LSA. Now, the catch is the higher rocker arm ratio, which the LS motors have, make for a wider LSA, and increase open acceleration of the cam makes for a wider LSA, which the LS cams are also the same for. So when you factor all this in, he didn't give any numbers, specifics, but it's going to be really close. And if you go slightly narrow on your LSA, you won't go wrong. Because he even did a test where he said you can be 1 degree narrower in LSA, and it's essentially the same. Essentially the same for power output. Okay, and now your duration is your LSA times 2 plus your overlap. So that's going to give you, here's your LSA. This is your typical group of LSAs for the LS motors, and your 50 thousandths duration and your advertised duration. Another thing, he said a general rule of thumb in a typical cam motor was advancing the cam 2 to 5 degrees, and that one is more difficult to tell what you would achieve by advancing it, but he said usually advancing it more is going to lose less. If you advanced it too far, you're going to lose less power than if you don't have it advanced enough. Also, for octane, when you're trying to figure out if you're trying to maximize power on 87 octane, you want about 100. He says he shoots for 170 psi cranking pressure, and 93 octane is going to be 200 psi. So You have to decide where you want to be with that. I ran a couple of engine combinations down here with 87 octane. I figured for a street motor, you want to maximize the power on the cheapest fuel. So unless you got deeper pockets than me, it seemed like a good place to start because these cams or this setup provides excellent street torque on 87 octane with good idle. Now the 4.8 here, I have a little narrower overlap because a smaller motor makes it a little more difficult to tune, and sees larger overlap as a bigger cam. So versus if you have the same setup on a 6.0. So that's the 4.8 combination I came up with. Definitely the 862 706 heads with a 108 LSA, 208 50 thousandths duration, and gives you 45 degrees overlap, 174 psi. And here's a setup for a 5.3. And then finally a 6.0. Yeah, and if you'll notice, the smaller the valve is in relation to the cylinder, the tighter your LSA is going to be. So it's going to produce even more low RPM torque. All right, if you want to run some of your own numbers and come up with your own combination, you're going to need three calculators to figure out. First of all, you're going to want to figure out your static compression ratio. After it's all calculated, you can see down here, in this case, it was 10.46 for static. And this is at wallaceracing.com. Second thing you're going to want is your camshaft specs. Another thing at wallaceracing.com. You need your duration, your lobe separation angle, and your intake center line. And a critical piece you're going to be looking for out of here is the intake valve close. That's going to be what's needed for the next one, which gives you your dynamic compression ratio and also your cranking pressure, which is the number you're looking for here when you're trying to figure out, if you want 170 psi for 87 octane or 200 psi for 93 or whatever you're searching for. For the few people who have made it through all of this and might want to boost their vehicles later on, here's a great video by Richard Holdner talking about turbos with mild cams with tight LSAs. And basically all it does is, to me, what I'm getting out of it is you're not going to lose anything by putting these smaller cams in, especially because these have a mild overlap. Giant overlap, a turbo tends to push, the theory is it pushes a lot of the intake charge right out the exhaust. So with a mild overlap, the effect is not nearly as bad. And this is my preferred camshaft grinding place. They have a fantastic 550 lift lobe that's very stable and can still be used with beehive springs. All right, I hope this is enough information to get you guys headed in the right direction. I'd love to hear any comments or anything. Hopefully I didn't butcher it up too much and gave you all the details you need to get yourself started with a good high torque build for the street.